Hello and welcome to the Vermont PBS virtual screening of Coded Bias. We hope this film sheds some light on the complex issues surrounding artificial intelligence and facial recognition and bias. If the film has also sparked some questions, we hope to be able to answer some of those tonight. My name is Henry Epp. I'm a reporter and host of All Things Considered at VPR, and I'm joined by two people to discuss the film tonight. First, Joseph Neer. He's an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Vermont. His research interests include data privacy, computer security, and programming languages. And he received his BS in computer science from Indiana University and his MS and PhD in computer science from MIT. Hello, Joseph.
Hi.
And also joining us tonight is Falko Schilling, the Advocacy Director at the ACLU of Vermont. Falko received his law degree from Vermont Law School after attending Skidmore College. And prior to joining the ACLU, he spent 5 years at VPIRG, where he led advocacy efforts that led to the nation's first mandatory genetically engineered food labeling law and allowing dental therapists to practice in Vermont. Hello, Falko.
Hi there, and thanks so much for having me this evening.
Great to have you both. And again, we'd love to hear your questions or comments for our guests tonight. So please continue to type them in the chat box on the right side of your screen and include your name and what town or city you're in. And so let's get started. Joseph, I want to start with you. There was this line in the film that really struck me, which was, "The past dwells within our algorithms, excuse me." And we just heard a lot about how algorithms have developed bias. But can you tell us more about how we got to this point, how those algorithms originated and developed that bias over time?
Yeah, so a lot of these algorithms that, when people talk about algorithms today, it's more than just like a recipe for a computer to do, right? In the 60s, we had very small computers. You would write a tiny little program, the computer would just run it. Nowadays, these things that people use that they call algorithms, a lot of them have these machine learning components that are really learning from data. And so whatever's in the data, the computer learns how to do. And there were a bunch of examples of this in the film. A chatbot that learns to say mean things because people say mean things to it. And so if you tell a computer to do what the data says should be done, and the data has bias in it, the computer is going to learn to be biased, right? And so this is, in as much as these things are baked into the data that has been produced by society in the past, that effect is going to be replicated in anything we ask computers to do in the future.
Yeah. Well, Falko, we saw in the film that several jurisdictions around the country have moved to limit the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. That also happened here in Vermont last year. I'm curious what you see as the role of government regulation for both facial recognition and some of the algorithms that were discussed in the film.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. And so just a bit of background, Vermont was the first state in the nation to ban the use of law enforcement facial recognition technology, with a very limited exception for search and rescue via drone that we had on the books before. This is something the legislature did last year. And as the ACLU, we do have a number of concerns about how both facial recognition technology and algorithms are used, especially when it comes to the criminal legal system or any government operations where people's liberty interests are at stake. So these are particularly things like where people might be arrested, or people might be have determinations made about things like, are they a risk to be let out on bail, where algorithms can play in. And as you've heard before, that's where bias can have a role. But we have kind of the ACLU, when we think about these issues, we have three main principles that guide our work when we look at artificial intelligence and its role within government usage. So the first is there needs to be due process. And that means that people need the ability to contest the government decisions that have been made using artificial intelligence. They need the ability to say, this decision is incorrect for these reasons, and I have the ability to contest that. There also needs to be transparency. So the government needs to be open and honest about the uses of artificial intelligence, and people need to know where it's being used. That gives us the ability to keep track of this, and then also, find those places where the use within government might have bias or unintended consequences that could be really, really harmful. And then finally, the third principle would be non-discrimination, which is biases need to be identified and addressed with these technologies before they are implemented and used by government. This is actually a conversation that's happening in the State House right now. There's a bill that's looking at pretrial screening to try and help understand someone's risk to reoffend on probation, for instance. And in looking at that, one of the things you have to say is what are the tools that are being used? How have they been verified? Has their bias been examined? And what are those original data sets that are being put in there? And then finally, is there a human decision maker who can look at that information and look what these algorithms are spitting out and actually verify that would be the correct decision? So in instances like this, we have concerns where you say maybe these systems are built off of past criminal histories, because we know here in Vermont that we have a criminal legal system that disproportionately targets people of color. And if you put those data sets in, and we have disproportionately been targeting people of color, what might come out is a result that disproportionately sees those people as a threat or someone we might need to be concerned about for criminal behavior. So those are some of the main concerns that we have, and kind of the higher level principles we use to examine how government uses artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology as well.
Well, I mean, one interesting thing that you sort of touched on is, I mean, the government is using in some cases algorithms or AI, but they're not necessarily the ones developing that AI. So I think it was Kathy O'Neill in the film mentions an idea of an FDA for algorithms, something like a Food and Drug Administration. I mean, as it stands now, and Joseph, if you want to jump in here as well, I mean, does the government have the infrastructure to really dig into an algorithm and determine what's in there and what potential issues of bias might be there?
So I think nobody does. It's not just governments. A lot of these, especially the AI-based systems, this is like literally the cutting edge of research right now. Is how do they work? Just nobody knows. We know that on some kinds of tasks, they work really well. They're good at recognizing things in images. They're good at speech recognition. But how do we do it? We kind of build this big neural network thing. We feed it a bunch of data, and then we see what comes out. And how does it work inside? Literally, nobody knows. And so how do you know what it's going to do on the next image it sees? You kind of don't. And this is one of the big challenges in deploying these systems, is nobody really knows how they're going to act.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in there, because
Go ahead.
that's a concern, is the level of expertise, one that's needed to understand just how these systems are working at a base level, let alone being able to get under the hood and actually see the full functioning. This is something I know the House was literally struggling with just this week, where they were hearing testimony on, should they establish a permanent commission to look at artificial intelligence here in the state. The state of Vermont was one of the first states in the country to set up a task force to look at the use of artificial intelligence. And one of their number one recommendations was make sure this is a permanent task force that's in place, so we can continue to review these technologies as they roll out. And another one of their recommendations was the idea of creating a code of ethics for the use of artificial intelligence within the state government. But it's a very tricky issue. I think it's one where people recognize there's a need for regulation, but then they also recognize that there's a large gap between what your citizen legislator might know about these technologies now and what they might need to know to properly be able to regulate them. So it's a place where we are going to need to see government working with the people who have in-depth knowledge about this field and trying to help inform them as we develop adequate regulations.
Yeah, so I mean, if there is that gap, if government regulation, may not be able to cover the entirety of the issue. So, if not that, or perhaps in addition to that, are there technical solutions for algorithmic bias that are possible? I mean, and could we be going in and fixing the basis of some of these algorithms, Joseph?
So I think in some cases there are, I hope very much that there are some technical solutions that can help. But there's a whole bunch of challenges. And I think, anybody who claims to have a technical solution right now, you should be pretty skeptical because the technical solutions that we have right now, most of them don't work very well. I think that one challenge is that we don't know exactly how to specify what we even want these systems to do. So like, how do you define fairness or the absence of bias in a way that a computer can understand, right? These systems, the excuse is often, oh, it's just math. In a technical sense, it is just math. And that means if you want the computer not to make a biased decision, then you have to tell the computer, here's what it means to not make a biased decision. And we kind of don't know how to do that in math yet. And so I think that's a big challenge, is we have to be able to figure out what it is exactly we want. And we really haven't figured that out yet. The other piece of it is that even if we knew what we want, it's really hard to take these AI systems that nobody really understands how they work and kind of force them to behave in a specific way. So we can build, there have been lots of techniques proposed to say, if we define fairness this way, then here's a new technique for training your AI system so that it gives you a better score on this fairness metric. And so these things are possible, but none of those things come with a guarantee that says that on the next prediction that system makes, it won't make a mistake and do something biased anyway. We can kind of improve these systems on average against some metric that we specify, but there are no guarantees that it's going to do the right thing on the next prediction that it makes. And so I think a kind of complete technical solution, like, is there going to be one technology that somebody comes up with and just solves the problem? I really don't think so.
I want to go to a couple questions that we've got from the audience. First off, for either of you, do we know if facial recognition is in use anywhere in Vermont right now?
I can speak to that from the government context, because this is, we know of at least one place that's in use in the government context. So last year when we passed the ban on law enforcement's use of facial recognition technology, basically what we heard back from the law enforcement community is this is not something we're largely using. But after that ban passed, some uses came to light, in particular within the Office of the Attorney General, their office that works to address crimes against children of a sexual nature. They have an algorithm, they have a program that will go through, the materials that contain images of, sexual acts with children, really, really disturbing images, and will identify, they will have an identified victim or identified suspect, and we'll be able to go through those pictures, that data set, and identify if the victim is in there or if the suspect is in there. So they brought that to the legislature this year, because after the ban passed, they said, look, we can't use this technology anymore. This is now illegal. And we worked with the Attorney General's office and the Defender General's office to craft language that we thought provided adequate protections, both allowing them to use that technology in a way that we thought there's human verification of the images they're seeing. They're not using it to try and identify someone. So they're not pulling images from like a data set or security cameras. They have an identified suspect, and it's doing facial matching. And so that's a bill that's actually working its way through the legislature right now, but had to be addressed once that ban went into place. And then there's further legislation being considered right now that would do an analysis of where throughout state government artificial intelligence systems are being used. Because I do think we need to have a better handle on that. And so that's something that we support. But there's at least one place where that is being used, and there's been a robust public discussion about what's the appropriate use of that technology. And I think that's the appropriate way to move forward. And even as the ACLU can say, yes, I think this very limited use is appropriate. And we understand the need for it in that context.
Sort of in a similar vein, just in terms of finding a balance, I want to read a question from John in Norwich, who says, can Joe or Falko discuss the facial recognition that's used to apprehend people, or that was used to apprehend people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th? It seems like civilians are eager to cooperate with law enforcement to identify people.
So I can't speak specifically to any of the technology that was used to do that. I do know that there was a lot of images posted very publicly through different social media channels. And many of those social media channels are using facial recognition algorithms all the time. This is how Facebook says, is this you in this photo, or things like that. So I don't know exactly what specific technology was being used, but They had quite a large data set from the amount of information that was being shared out during the insurrection.
So I would echo that point exactly. I also have no further information on this specific thing, but the government had a lot of help in that case from a company and many companies, right? In terms of getting surveillance footage of people. We're all taking that surveillance footage of each other with our phones. And so, in a lot of ways, I'm more worried about what companies are doing with this information than what the government is.
Yeah. Well, just sticking with that point, Joe, I mean, are these algorithms, is this technology, especially in the context of it being used by larger corporations, I mean, is that just baked into our lives at this point? Is there any going back in your view?
I don't know if there's any going back, but I do think we can do a better job, and I think it's tricky because it is baked into our experience of society at this point, and so like movement is going to be kind of against the like direction of momentum. And I think it's really, really hard for any single person to do it, right? There are calls all the time to like delete your Facebook account or whatever. And I don't think honestly one person deleting their Facebook account is going to have a big effect. And so I do think that there's a major role for government to play there. I don't think Facebook is going to decide tomorrow to change what they're doing. It's working really well for them. I think the government's going to have to tell them to change. But if there were very clear regulations around this stuff, in Europe, for example, under GDPR, people have the right not to have decisions made for them by automated decision-making systems. If we had something like that in the United States, then some of the things that you see Facebook doing, they just wouldn't be allowed to do anymore. And they might make less money, but I think it would change how they behave and what they do with our data.
We have another question from Kate, who asks, is it a fair statement to say we are using AI blindly, and how can we apply it appropriately?
I think that's a totally fair statement. I think that the kind of approach that we've seen both on the kind of computer science research side and also in terms of the deployment of AI by companies and even by governments is you build a thing and you throw a bunch of data in and you see what happens. And we've gotten lucky in a bunch of cases, and things that people think are good things have happened. And I would call it pretty blind. I mean, nobody really knows what's going on inside of these systems. So I think that we're seeing the effect of that in the sense that when we decide we want to control how the systems work, we want it, to stop making a biased decision, for example, and start making better decisions as we've defined them over here. We find that we often can't. And I don't have the answer to that. I don't think anybody has the answer to that right now. There's a lot of research going on this in the computer science community for sure. And I think we still don't know the answer yet either. I do think that the answer in the short term is to just be more careful about how we deploy these systems and give them less power, right? Don't kind of empower these systems to decide what happens in our lives. Instead, maybe put them in an advisory role and then have humans decide. And in the short term, I think that's maybe the best we can do.
In terms of, on an individual level, are there things that individuals can do to protect themselves from algorithmic bias, or to to do something in the context of some of the issues that were raised in this film?
So I think I would say that there's a really quite limited set of things that an individual can do. From a kind of a privacy perspective, you can do things like not have social media accounts. It's much harder to be tagged in photos if you don't have a Facebook account, for example. But that's a hard piece of advice to follow. In a lot of ways, you need a Facebook account to do anything in society now. So, a lot of these companies kind of have us in a really tough position. I would say that an important thing kind of as you go about your life is to be cognizant of the fact that these systems that are so ingrained in our society now are specifically designed to make people money. So, one of the things I do, for example, because I don't want to spend all my time staring at my phone, is I've deleted a bunch of apps from my phone, and that just kind of helps me, I think, have a better life. And these kinds of things, just when there are AI-based systems, especially that are empowered to control the things you see, the way that you spend your life, you can stop using them. But I think the most powerful thing that we can do is, to call on government to make regulation. I think that's probably the way that we actually solve the problem.
In terms of sort of the legal avenues here, Falko, I mean, do you expect, we saw some things in this film in terms of algorithmic decisions being challenged in court. Do you expect those kinds of issues of due process that were brought up in the film to continue to challenge certain uses of both AI and facial recognition in the courts?
I do. I think that's something that is going to have to be an evolving area of the law, is how do you adequately challenge those decisions, and is going to be an area where defense attorneys and others are going to have to learn quite a bit about this technology to be able to make those cases. But it's really important to be able to challenge those decisions. So we know in some places around the country, as they've looked to eliminate things like cash bail, one of the things that they turn to is algorithms that can decide whether or not someone's has a risk to reoffend or is a risk of flight. And those decisions, those can have incredible impacts on people's lives. One day spent in jail can have a profound impact on your ability to keep a job and other things. And so we need to make sure that, that's one why the ACLU is not supportive of creating decisions that will decide if someone is free or not based on algorithms without the actual input of humans. But it is something where there's going to be need to be more and more due process around how that information is used. And I do think one thing that I've always been an advocate for is that we need to have a greater expectation of privacy in some of this data. The current jurisprudence around the use of this technology is whatever you're doing on your phone is basically considered to be something you're doing in the public square in front of everyone. And I don't think that's how most people think about their usage of their phone. It's a very personal device. But from the standpoint of the Fourth Amendment and law enforcement, that is something where you have a very low expectation of privacy. So as we see this universe of information being created on our phones, this constant trail of data that says so much about us, I think we're going to need to have a conversation about what is actually private in this country and what do we consider public information, because the law has just not kept up in that area. We're still at a point where if you want to talk to someone and the law enforcement would need a warrant, you need to actually call them on the phone. But if you're sending a text message or an email, you don't have the same expectation of privacy that you would have in a phone call or a letter, because our jurisprudence is just so out of date. And so I think that is a larger conversation that needs to happen, is what our actual expectations of privacy should be. And that is a place where states can actually go above and beyond the floor set in the Fourth Amendment by the U.S. Supreme Court and say, we want to grant people a greater expectation of privacy in the information that they are creating or is being shared through electronic servers. So that's an area that I think is of concern going forward, and I think something that we're going to need to address both as a state and as a nation.
Well, just sticking with that, in terms of the state level here in Vermont, is there further legislation to regulate? You touched on a little bit of this before, but what other regulations are in the works, if any, in terms of people's privacy online and using different technologies that use AI?
Well, and I know there was a discussion last year in the legislature that got kind of sidetracked when COVID hit, along with a lot of other things, looking at adopting biometric privacy information acts. So this is something that is in existence in other states and would go beyond just the government use of this information, but would make people disclose when they're collecting this information and how it might be used. So that's one step, but I also think we could look more specifically at putting stronger protections around the type of information that is created through these electronic means. So I don't think anything in particular right now in the legislature on that. I would say another thing I would point to is there's a piece of legislation that would call for an audit of how the government is currently using these types of systems. That's something we do strongly support. But it's good to remember that the information that's created by private companies often can end up in government hands quite easily. So that concern about privacy is not just one with how government is using it, but how they're able to access this information that's created in the public, or by public companies and private companies, and not just by the government itself.
One question from Kate. If she says, if the law hasn't caught up, then what advantage do we give the criminals, and how do we catch up?
So I don't think the law where it is right now is giving an advantage to criminals, because I don't think people understand the amount of information they're leaving behind just when they leave their house to go walk down the street. If you have a Fitbit, that's going to be tracking your every movement. If you have a cell phone, that's going to be pinging off cell phone towers and showing your location along the way. Any text you're sending, that's going through a server. So these are things where I don't think at this point in time we're advantaging people who might be trying to commit crimes. If anything, we're giving even more information to law enforcement that they can help track down and identify people with. And I think we need to continue to try and strike a more healthy balance there.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of, maybe for both of you, in terms of what we are volunteering, I think, I'm going to all the moments when I've downloaded an app or signed up for a website and hit okay on the terms of service, and I'm not reading through this lengthy document that is probably, allowing this company to use my data in whatever way. I mean, should we be paying closer attention to that? Or is that something that we as individuals should be pausing and taking a second moment to think about before we sign those documents?
I think honestly, there's such a big power imbalance between you and that company that is showing you those terms of service that it should not be your problem, right? The company should not put you in that position. They shouldn't be allowed to, in my opinion. And that kind of terms of service where, you can't use the product unless you sign away all your rights. I think it's unethical. I don't think they should be doing it. Yes, I think it is useful to read one or two of those terms of service documents, because it will teach you just how crazy they are. And you basically never have to read another one again, because they're all the same. They all say, you give us all your rights, right? You give us all your data and we can do whatever we want with it. And so, this is, I think, one of the areas where there's just this huge power imbalance between, companies that are collecting our data and those of us who are giving the data up. And that's what we need to do something about. Reading the terms of service is not really going to help us as individuals.
Yeah, I would agree. I think this is a place where we've created this illusion that there is the ability to have individual decision making and to create a limited digital footprint that you're creating online, and just to interact with the modern world. That is so incredibly difficult. And I will say, I know some people who I think have navigated that, but they're using a landline, they're barely ever going on the internet, like they're living off the grid. And there are people in Vermont I know who live that lifestyle and make those decisions, but it's just really hard for anyone who's engaging with modern technology not to be creating that immense digital footprint. So I think I agree with Joe that what we need to do is we need to look at those terms and service, and as a society decide what rights are we not going to allow people to be signing away in these agreements, because that power imbalance is huge. And I will admit, even me personally, as someone who thinks about this quite a bit, there have been times I've looked at an app and I'm like, I know they're going to be selling my data to absolutely everyone. I know about their bad data practices, and I'll just use it anyway because I might want to connect with someone, and that might be the only way to do it. Or there's content I want to see on that app, and I know it, and I know it's not the best data, not the best practices. But putting this solely on consumers and individual responsibility, I think is the wrong way to go. We need to create more responsibility by the corporations that are engaging the use of this technology.
We just have a couple minutes left. So I want to ask both of you, are either of you optimistic that either on the governmental level or on the private sector level, that some of these issues will start to be addressed in a more serious way in the immediate future? And what do you think that might look like?
So I've got a lot of optimism actually about this, because you saw actually a lot of the reason for it in the film, and some of the other kind of pieces of the level of awareness is going up kind of in the world about this stuff, right? And it's things like this film, things like the film The Social Dilemma. It's, people understand that something is very wrong here now in a way that they didn't 5 years ago. And I think in the computer science research community, people are starting to understand that too, right? Even 5 years ago, even a couple of years ago, we had people in the computer science community who were like the pillars of the AI research community, saying things like, the algorithms are not a problem. You just need to fix your training data, right? And most of those people are changing their minds, and they're saying, yeah, there is a problem. We need to worry about this. We need to be responsible about this. We, meaning computer science researchers and companies that deploy these systems. And so I think there's a shift in the way people see the situation. They understand that there's a problem now, and that's only going to grow. And so, the companies have all the power right now, but if enough people understand that bad things are happening, then I think that something will change for the better.
Falko, what about you?
Well, I like Joe's optimism. That made me feel a little bit better, because I do think from the governmental side, I do think in terms of regulators, they're often playing catch up and trying to, once they realize something has gone badly, that's when it's time to address it. So I hate to say this, but I'm glad to hear about Joe's optimism for the ability of self-regulation within that community. But what I'm hoping for is that as those voices grow louder and those standards are developed for how these technologies should be used more ethically, that there is more of a conjunction with government about how to actually put those laws in place. And I'm glad this is a conversation we're having and starting to have here in Vermont, at least. But I think it's going to need to be that type of conversation, because this is not something that at least a citizen legislature is going to be able to tackle all on their own without a lot of help.
To be clear about this, I am not optimistic that Facebook tomorrow will say, I've seen the light, let's change, right? It's not going to happen. I think at the end of the day, the change that we need to see basically will destroy these companies. I mean, their business model is based on exploiting us. And so, I think companies like Facebook and social networks and things like that can exist and should exist, but, I don't think they'll be controlling 25% of the economy if they're doing things ethically, right? And I am not optimistic that we'll get there because people will kind of figure out that they should be doing the right thing. I think what it's going to take is all of society saying, we don't like this, government, please fix it. And the government, I think, will lag behind popular opinion on this as well, because, as Falko pointed out, legislators tend not to be the most up to date on technology. But I do think if there are enough people, saying that we need to change things, then legislators will eventually do something about it.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you both so much. Falko Schilling of the ACLU of Vermont and Joseph Neer, a professor at UVM. And thank you everyone for joining us and for your questions. And this talk is going to be archived on the Vermont PBS YouTube page. I'm Henry Epp with VPR. Thanks to Vermont PBS for hosting this event. And thank you all for joining.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.